Welcome to the Loins of History podcast. My name is Jay, and I'm joined by my co-host Colin. And this is the second episode in our little mini-series on capitalism and socialism in the United States. Still continuing our American Political Foundations series. Last episode, we covered the early American economy, talked about how the 13 colonies were founded as charter companies in the beginning, and then transitioned to independent institutions, economically speaking, later on. We talked about kind of some early economic policy, how we were transitioning from mercantilism to capitalist schools of thought. And in this episode, we're really going to cover the 1800s and the American economy and kind of economic policy during that century. So, Colin, how did the 1800s start off for the United States, economically speaking?
Thanks, Jay. And it's actually an interesting topic that we're going to be discussing because, you know, we think of the U.S. as a capitalist country. We're this free market economy. We're going to let the invisible hand guide the market. But the reality is we've never really been a fully capitalist or fully socialist country. We've had elements of both. And in the early 1800s, obviously, this is way before Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto written in the 1840s. And socialism really didn't come about until the late 1800s with the rapid rise in industrialization. So the early 1800s especially were more of a transition from capitalism or from mercantilism to capitalism. And there's still elements of the old mercantile system that existed really until the Civil War. And the Civil War, in a lot of ways, was a conflict between obviously it was mostly over slavery, but there was still an economic piece to that where you had a conflict between this New World capitalism and Old World mercantilism. So in the early 1800s, you had the creation of the central bank by Alexander Hamilton. So yeah, and I actually think one of the biggest factors in the United States economy's development was the creation of that central bank that Alexander Hamilton was the biggest proponent and champion of. He created the first national bank in the 1790s. And then there's a second national bank that was created, but ultimately Andrew Jackson did everything he could to destroy the central bank. He believed it was the epitome of corruption. As a matter of fact, he called for an audit of the central bank, and he didn't renew their charter. So it was kind of wild. You hear Ron Paul audit the Fed. This is kind of the first audit the Fed proclamation you have. So right. I don't know, Jay, what do you think?
Yeah, the central or national bank was one of the main contentious issues in the early republic, and it's kind of indicative, as for our listeners will recall back to our episodes on the history of American political parties. You had the Federalists. Hamilton would have thought of himself as a Federalist. Who were pro-government. Rather, they wanted a heavier federal government hand in the economy, of which the central bank was the biggest part of that. Anti-Federalists, later Democrats or Republicans, they wanted the exact opposite. So like you said, Jackson let the charter for the first national bank expire, I think in like the 1820s, maybe?
1830s.
Don't quote me on that, but 1830s.
It was the 1830s.
And it went away. Like we didn't have a central bank during the high period of the Democrats in the early 1800s, really up until the Civil War. So
yeah, it was 1836.
Right. But
and by the way, the chief Nicholas Biddle was he was arrested. He was arrested and jailed.
Yeah. See, there is a precedent for Mar-a-Lago raids.
Well, it's really
Potato, potato. Too soon.
It's really more like Iceland jailing the bankers after the crash in 2008. It's not. It's happened before. Yeah,
that's
Iceland
awesome.
jailed.
I didn't know about that. Yeah. Yeah, we probably have some bankers that probably need to go to jail.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things about the with the banks, it's interesting to note that currency looked very different in the 1800s, especially the early 1800s. The standardization was not the same, which eventually led to a greenback versus gold standard debate starting in the Civil War. But we'll get to that in a minute.
Well, so it's probably helpful to talk about, like, this is all in the context of the Industrial Revolution. Sometimes it's called the First Industrial Revolution because there was another period later on where some other technological advances, think like Thomas Edison's time frame, that did it. But in this first industrial evolution or revolution, and really capitalism taking hold over Europe and North America, we've got all these different technologies that are being invented that is rapidly increasing commerce over larger areas. So one of those inventions is the railroad, right? The Brits invented the railroad, and you were able to transport goods cheaply and quickly over a large distance. So, to your point on the currencies, we, if our listeners recall in our last episode, we talked about mercantilism was largely a system based on bartering, right? It wasn't necessarily like, I'm going to give you X amount of dollars for goods, and then I can then use those dollars to go, reinvest in my business, etc. But we begin to see that here. We begin to see the explosion of commerce and the ability to just produce more. We see manufacturing taking off. We see a need for essentially banknotes. And to Colin's point, at this time, banknotes, there was no central bank for a large part of this to issue banknotes. And so they were issued by local banks. And there was no like one currency to rule them all, so to speak.
It's interesting that you say that. So it's wild to think about that. We had a time where there was not really a standard currency. Like, you could go to a different part of the country and a totally different banknote would be issued to you. And the trading, the value of those banknotes were based on the bank itself that was issuing it. So, and you bring up a good point, and this kind of ties in the economic growth and the technological inventions of the Industrial Revolution, especially in America, well, really in general, worldwide. In order to innovate and create and build a lot of these, railroads, these giant buildings, these factories, you needed a capital investment. You needed infusions of cash from loans from the bank. So what you start to see is, at this point, the centralization, I think, occurs in a lot of ways because you had large businesses that wanted to build these railroads, large businesses that needed to start mines and factories. And in order to do that, you needed a loan. And so it just kind of leads, and that's sort of what capitalism, you have this infusion of loans and cash into the economy. Eventually, I think that leads to, and jumping way ahead in the 1970s where we go completely fiat. But this is sort of the origins of fiat currency, where it's like, well, we have a finite supply of gold. We can't really issue more out. And like I said, you see that in 1861 and 62. Hey, we got to fund this really expensive war. How do we do that? Print more money. It's a debt note. So you start to see that as the economy begins growing, people want to build more. Well, in order to do that, you need money. How do we get money? We go get a loan from a bank. How do we get more money? Well, we got to print more money. So you start to see this more and more.
Capital is hey, I've got something of X value that is backed by something else. So, for example, the dollar did exist at this time. It just wasn't standardized, i.e., what one bank said, hey, this many ounces, I'm just hypothetically speaking here, this many ounces of gold and silver equals $1 by one bank in Massachusetts might not be the same thing down in Georgia. So, but it's, hey, when someone brings this banknote to the bank, it's supposed to be redeemable in the thing that it's backed by, right? So when people talk about capital investment, they would go to a bank, they would say, "Hey, I need X amount of money for a loan." And they would give you the money. You were supposed to be able to, if they were to call back those banknotes, you were supposed to be able to, like, whatever that capital was that you backed it by, you were supposed to be able to either pay that back to the bank or, produce something of equal value. And what we'll see is during the 1800s, this was very topsy-turvy. It wasn't standardized very well. But to the point I guess I'm trying to make here, it's that capitalism writ large is the substitution of things of value for something else of another value, if that makes sense.
Boy, now we're really getting into monetary policy. Oof.
Right. I really, what I'm trying to say is, like, monetary policy and banking system, the financial system, really is kind of what created capitalism as we know it today. And it allowed the economy to skyrocket.
Simply put, it's the fuel that fed the fire of capitalism. Like you need one to have the other.
Thank you for saying that more succinctly than I.
You know what? I have to simplify things in my own brain. So, it was not standardized to the Legal Tender Act of 1862. So think about that. That's how long the economy existed. Basically, hey, it's a little different here. It's a little different there.
Right.
So yeah, remember that date, 1862, because I think in the next episode, we're going to come back to that when we start talking more about, because this currency issue does not go away really ever. I think it's important. We've covered the currency and what the financial system looked like, but I think it's important that we note that what some of the rest of the economy looked at. I think it's important for people to understand that this was an agrarian-based society that was very rural, and it was, we have factories. Everybody thinks of the Industrial Revolution of factories and urban areas. It was the complete opposite. Things were built in cottages. You had a gunsmith, a blacksmith, a goldsmith, and these were operating as like this cottage-based industry. That is replaced. But that's the way the American economy worked. And at the time, I think it's also important to note, as we mentioned, we're not fully capitalist because we had high tariffs protecting American industry, which goes against capitalism. It's not the free market. It's not the invisible hand. We had high tariffs in order to protect American interests at home,
right?
Which I think is important to note.
It might be helpful to talk about, at this point, what's called the American system, which the American system, kind of what Colin was talking about at the beginning of this episode, it was really taking the economic principles of Alexander Hamilton, which would have belonged to the Federalists and then to the Whigs, and it systematized it into this economic school of thought that was championed by a dude named Henry Clay. Now, for us Americans here, if we hearken back to our high school U.S. history days, I can almost guarantee you were taught about Henry Clay, and you were probably taught that he was a really mean, evil guy, because and he probably was, by the way, but he's most famously known here in the United States for what's called the corrupt bargain. The original corrupt bargain. There were a few things later on that were also called corrupt bargains, and that's because they were trying to appeal to the original corrupt bargain, where essentially in the election of 1824, so we're in the 1820s here, Henry Clay was a member of Congress, but he had run for president. And this is back when presidential elections were based on whoever got the highest number of votes became the president, and whoever got the second highest number of votes became the vice president. The original presidential election thing. If there was a tie, or if it was too close to call, it boiled down to the House of Representatives, and the House of Representatives were to elect a president. Long story short, the corrupt bargain was Henry Clay came in third place, and he was like, hey, I'm going to put my backing behind this one guy and not the other. Yeah, so it went back to the House of Representatives. Andrew Jackson originally got the most votes, but John Quincy Adams, if we remember here, this all makes sense. Andrew Jackson's kind of a Democrat. John Quincy Adams and Henry Clay are like Whigs, but they got number 2 and 3. And Andrew Jackson got the most number of votes, but Henry Clay was like, hey, I hate Andrew Jackson. I'm going to put my support behind John Quincy Adams and John Quincy in the House of Representatives. And John Quincy Adams ended up winning the election and beating Andrew Jackson. This was what was known as the Krupp bargain. Anyway, that's what Henry Clay's kind of known for mostly. He was also the biggest champion of what's called the American system. The American system primarily consisted of 3 key tenets. The first one was a central bank. The second one was high taxes, and the third one was high tariffs. So it's anti-free trade, which a lot of, today we know capitalism as being commensurate with free trade, but anti-free trade, pro-American industry. So the whole point of high taxes, central bank, and high tariffs were to increase the competitiveness of American goods on the American market and use all that so that you would then tax that to increase the federal budget and allow the federal government to go do more things.
It's kind of interesting. It sounds very similar to a hybrid mercantilism. And I think that's the point we're trying to make, that it's not like hey, the American Revolution happened. Congratulations, we're all capitalists. No, it was a gradual shift. And I think the Industrial Revolution was a catalyst for change.
Yeah. And it's also, to me, this is fascinating here because later on, Abraham Lincoln calls himself a proponent of Henry Clay tariffs. This is I believe he said that sometime in the 1850s when he was running for office. And so it's safe to say that the Whig, the continuation of Alexander Hamilton's economic theories would run from Hamilton through Henry Clay to Abraham Lincoln, and so we see the economic foundations of the Republican Party, and what really took off during the Civil War was these high taxes, high tariffs, high government sponsored projects that Democrats despised, and we kind of see the fissures in the American social fabric forming.
Yeah, I think that's an important note to make is with the early Industrial Revolution, or I think they call it the first Industrial Revolution within the United States, like I mentioned, it's still, as a whole, agrarian, rural, cottage-based economy. But in the North especially, you start to see technology, I think the Erie Canal was surveyed. You start to see more factories. The Eli Whitney with the cotton gin. You start to see more manufacturing based on, like interchangeable parts. So it replaced the need for slave labor. And I think that's important to note because with the Industrial Revolution, slave labor, as it was in the United States at the time, where you're just used to harvest raw materials and, build things in basically a cottage, became obsolete. So within the North's economy, you really had no need for slave labor. They were building factories. They were textile mills that began. So they didn't have a need for that labor, especially. Whereas in the South, which, like Jay just said, the Democrats did not like this government intervention because it threatened their economic system. And so, like you said, the fissures began to slavery was the big key issue, but you also see, because these economic impacts that it was having on these two different regions, they started to go their separate ways. And I think in a lot of ways, it's kind of an old world versus new world economics, in that the South, even dating back to the Revolution, still was very, they had a lot of loyalists during the American Revolution. I think they still kind of viewed themselves as very different than their northern Americans, fellow Americans in the North, because they still had a lot of this old world mercantile. Their economy was driven by raw materials, cotton, rice, indigo, and then they would export it out, and that's what they needed. So they didn't like tariffs.
So, and it's also, so like immigration didn't really kick off in the United States until the second half of the 1800s. And when it did, you had primarily English-speaking immigrants, Irish, coming into the Northeast. That was cheap labor coming into these factories that didn't migrate down into the South until much later. Ellis Island being the quintessential, hey, I'm an American, or I'm an immigrant, I'm coming to the United States, I can go into these factories. What that did culturally was, in the South, you kind of had this, I don't know this for sure, but I think it's helpful to think of this. You kind of had this like second level gentry that had either immigrated or kind of just naturally formed in the South. You had these plantation owners, you had a merchant class where the workers were primarily slave labor, and they would work the fields, and this quote unquote American gentry, they would be the owners. They would be the ones that was, when I say gentry, I mean, like, think of a lower nobility in Great Britain, and, that primarily consisted of white landowners. When we see these early economic divisions and cultural divisions in the country, we had immigrants work in the factories up in the North, but in the South we had, slave labor work in the fields primarily. And we just see like these two different cultures forming between the North and the South.
Yeah. And I think that's going to be important to keep in mind, because it helps explain why even non-slave owning Southerners would still support the Civil War on the side of the Confederacy. I think it's important to note that, because they still had a vested interest in maintaining that kind of mercantile-ish system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And one thing we were talking about earlier was we forget what caused the Civil War. A key part of that was economic policy. Here in the United States, if someone asks you the question, what caused the Civil War, you're walking into a trap. Because if you don't say slavery, you're a racist. Yes, slavery was a huge key issue, but when we put these things in these like ha gotcha style questions, what we miss on is what you're not allowed to say, because if you neglect the role of slavery, you're somehow a racist. What we miss out on when we speak in these terms is that Whigs and Republicans in the North were very pro economic policies at the federal level that helped northern industries and did damage to the southern economy. And the abolition of slavery was probably the main, but just one aspect of that. Tariffs is a great example. What tariffs did was it prevented, so it helped when you're selling the finished product, thinking about textiles, when you're selling the finished product to American consumers, a tariff raises the price of imported goods. So like textiles produced in Europe, those were more expensive because when they came into the American market, there was this tariff that was slapped on them. And if you're a business selling, British or French produced dresses, for example, you've got to sell them at a higher price to overcome what you just paid on that tariff. Whereas if you're an American dressmaker, you didn't have to pay that tariff, so you can sell it at a lower price. That's good for the Northern American market. However, that's bad because it prevents Southern consumers from buying anywhere but from the North, and it increases the cost for Southern cotton farmers to sell their stuff to Europe. They were almost they were forced to sell their cotton to Northern textile manufacturers. And because of that lack of competition, the price that the Northern textile manufacturers bought, they were able to dictate the terms of the price of cotton because of a lack of competition from other textile stuff. That was a huge influence on why the Civil War took place.
Yeah, I think that's why you see, like I mentioned, the question of non-slave owning Southerners fighting on the side of the Civil War. It's like, well, it kind of makes sense if you understand the economic interests that they had at stake, and that so they were willing to fight to maintain that system. So we are rapidly approaching the Civil War. And before we get there, because I think that is a culmination point, a turning point, whatever, obviously it's huge in American history, but where we see this massive shift in the Industrial Revolution really kick off. But before we do that, I want to go back and say, Jay, what was some of the technology that was invented in this first industrial revolution in the U.S., and how did it affect the U.S. economy?
Right. So we talked about the railroad already, and that was a huge one. Colin, you mentioned the cotton gin, which, again, if we harken back to our high school days here in the United States, we were all taught about the phrase how cotton was king, right? So the cotton gin allowed cotton farmers to via this machine, the cotton gin, to pick the seeds out of the harvested cotton at a significantly faster rate, which allowed them to, get cotton into the market much faster. So that was huge. One that we haven't really talked about yet, that's kind of commensurate with the railroad, is the steam engine, right? That allowed trains to be a thing, but at the same time, it also helped other machines. It provided an engine to be produced, and kind of what we see coal becoming huge because it's replacing other forms of fuel and energy, and now coal, in order to fuel steam engines, becomes a huge commodity at that
resource.
time.
Yeah.
Resource. Thank you.
I think that's important to note. So you had all this technology and the North was investing in this. A lot of these technologies were being deployed in Northern factories. So here, I think it's a good time to transition to the Civil War. And Jay and I aren't going to go into every battle, and we could do a whole podcast on the Civil War. There's a Ken Burns documentary on the Civil War. There's a lot to it, but specifically relating to the economy and capitalism and how it eventually led to the rest of the Industrial Revolution and the impacts it had. I think this is a huge culminating point. So like I mentioned earlier, it is an old world, kind of new world this kind of new capitalism backed by industrialism in the North, fighting this old world kind of mercantile system. And eventually, obviously the North wins and industrial. And I think that is a point where you see America as a whole start to embrace the Industrial Revolution, start to move to I think what we would look at and call a more capitalist society. We still had high tariffs. That still existed up until, really the titans of industry and the kind of the Gilded Age and post-Gilded Age. But also to note that the Legal Tender Act of 1862 was passed, a standardized legal tender. So we mentioned greenbacks earlier in the episode. This is the first time the government has printed money in this quantity in order to pay a debt. So, and it caused inflation. It caused a lot of problems. And actually, the first income tax was passed at this point in order to pay down that debt and pay on some of this inflation. So I think this is really where you start to see a government say, hey, we need more money. Go ahead and print it. Here's how we're going to do it. We're going to issue these greenbacks, which was just legal tender that was colored green. That's where it gets the name greenback, in order to pay this debt. And so that, I think, is important because you start to see that more and more frequently. And then over the next couple decades, and really even 150 years, you start to see this constant battle between the government influencing monetary policy by taking on more debt in order to pay for things like funding conflicts and wars. That's really honestly the most expensive. So it's important to note.
Yeah. So the Civil War, the Republicans were able to finally legislate their American system policies because Southern Democrats weren't in Congress. It's nice when all those Democrats that you had to fight with before the Civil War just didn't show up for 4 or 5 years. So you can legislate whatever you want at that time. Hence income tax being a thing in the 1860s. Hence the federal bank becoming a thing. Hence tariffs going like up 10 or 20 points or something like that during this time.
Yeah, and I think this is kind of, I think the fiat currency was, that term had been around, but this is definitely where you start to see a more fiat style currency. In gold standard, obviously, if it is a gold standard, that dollar is tied to a set amount of gold behind it. A fiat currency means this is backed by not like the government or nothing or just our faith in it. It's backed by the faith that you have in the United States economy to pay this note off. So there's a difference there. It's not like a lot of people are like, fiat currency, it's backed by nothing. Technically, that's not true. It's backed by the ability of the U.S. economy to pay this debt off, to pay, for the government to be able to levy a tax on the American economy and pay this debt that they owe you, through this legal tender. That's, in a very simplistic way, that's how you think about it. It's not just paper. It is backed by something. It's just not by gold. And it is, it's a little conceptual, and you have to have a lot of faith in it, high trust, if you will. But it's where you really start to see that. And throughout the later 1800s, and especially the 1920s, this becomes a huge issue.
All right. So setting the stage for kind of where we're going here in the future, we're seeing the seeds of socialism here in the United States kind of take place. Socialism in the United States is kind of decades behind Europe in that, we'll see the formation of labor unions. Really, the first labor union was like in the 1860s here in the United States, but it kind of petered out. And the AFL doesn't get formed until the 1880s, whereas labor unions had been a thing for decades prior to in Europe. So with this rapid industrialization, with really during the Civil War and kind of in the Gilded Age that follows, you see Republican economic policy taking center stage, and with this rapid industrialization, you see, oh shoot, it appears that businesses are taking advantage of immigrants, especially after the Civil War. You had all these freed formerly slave labor that is now entering the market, and the issues that caused and the advantages that were being taken on a lot of these folks. And you see kind of the grounds of workers' movements beginning, and we'll get more into detail that in the next episode. So we see kind of like the rise of capitalism and then the seeds of socialism being sown here in the United States.
Jay, thanks for that summary and for setting the stage for us next week. I think it's going to be even more exciting and action-packed than this episode was. But just to summarize in closing what we talked about today, at this point in the U.S. economy, there's a growing fissure between North and South. There's a transition from this old world mercantilism into this new American system, American style capitalism that we're going to see culminate in the Civil War, where a lot of these policies and movements were set up and really take root at a national, fully national level. We also start to see the changing from rural to urban and relying on manual labor and cottage-based machine labor and factories in order to produce goods. So if you like what we're doing on the Loins of History, please subscribe to our Patreon page and support us. It's how we keep this ad-free. Also, Jay and I are on social media. We're starting to dabble more and more. As we get better with Instagram and Twitter. I feel like we're a little bit almost too old for that, for TikTok at this point, but who knows. So please subscribe, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and again, thank you for listening to the Loins of History.